Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements, and we are starting with the Antinomies of Georg Lukács by James Turley, who was writing for the Weekly Worker about 10 years ago in January of 2013. And we're talking about this because the distinctions made here are relevant to both a series I'm doing engaging with Platypus Affiliated Society and particularly Chris Catrone, and a series I am doing engaging with Marxist Unity Group that hasn't started yet, but will soon. And the people around Cosmonaut Magazine, because the influence of Mike McNair, James Turley, and the Weekly Worker on the Marxist Unity Group and Cosmonaut Magazine, primarily through the politics of Donald Parkinson and Parker and other people associated with the group, as well as going into the responses by Chris to this debate. I actually think this also gets to some of my own ambiguities about Lukács, a thinker that I have kind of mixed feelings about, and we've done several episodes, like I've said. You can go back and listen to the Amog Sahu interviews on Lukács if you would like to get my and Amog's opinion on Lukács. You can also find a Kohei Saito piece on Lukács, which I don't think is particularly enlightening, actually, but nonetheless, I have discussed it in the past here as well, and you can also go into an interview I did with Daniel Tutt on the matter. But this starts a series that we're going to go into where we have a debate between Turley, Lawrence Parker, and Mike McNair, as well as Chris Catrone intervening. And then it'll bring us to a debate on the nature of the Platypus Affiliated Society between Matt McNair and Chris, which I read when I left the organization. So you will know a little bit about my own thought process here as well, historically, about why I left Platypus Affiliated Society in 2013. It was this, and then another panel at EndNote's plenary for at the Platypus annual conference. EndNotes did a speech, and between Mike McNair and EndNotes, I was convinced that my role in the organization probably wasn't super great for either side anymore, and I left. Another thing to consider, there was debates with other members of my editorial board at the North Star, because one of them was also a member of Platypus, and he left. His name was Ben Campbell. He left for completely different reasons, but nonetheless, it is good to know and have this context, because I'm going into debates to get into some of the differences between Chris and I. When we actually get to Chris's response, I'm also going to be in the series addressing Chris's response to other articles in the long engagement with Chris scenario. So we'll see. You'll actually see comments and stuff from Chris on other episodes throughout. So because I'm giving him right of response, and he will be allowed to come on my show if he wants and talk to me about all this at the end. But we're going to start off with the Lukács text today. This doesn't have a lot to do with Chris directly. It's more about Lukács himself. This is from the Weekly Worker from 2013. You can find this online. All right. Though his key text language in obscurity for a half century, Georg Lukács reemerged in the late 20th century with a reputation as one of the greatest Marxist thinkers. Leading members of the Socialist Workers' Party eagerly declared themselves among their disciples. However, James Turley argues his work constitutes an obstacle to revolutionary politics. And we're going to make this a little bigger because it's kind of small. This essay is probably best described as a distant cousin of two talks I delivered last year. The first, entitled Georg Lukács, Philosopher of Revolution at the Communist University, and the second, Class Consciousness and Party Towards a Historical Critique of the Young Lukács in Historical Materialism's annual London conference. My focus there and here is the work produced by Georg Lukács in the 1920s, in particular History and Class Consciousness, regarded by most as his magnum opus, a lengthy, dense argument for the centrality of Hegelian thought to Marxism, whose influence persists not only through direct reference, but also through certain shared assumptions within Hegelian Marxism of all kinds, which have acquired the character of an unspoken obvious orthodoxy. Lukács produced a good deal of other work, most focused on the question of aesthetics and literary theory, but it is the grand thematic sweep and political urgency of history and class consciousness that's left a mark on left-wing thought. A distant cousin, partly because on neither occasion I was able to cram in enough detail to nail the coffin shut to my satisfaction, I also intend to flesh out what have been, up to now, some vague indications as to the place of philosophy within Marxism, but also the essay benefits from the debates and perspective interlocutions followed by my ramblings too long yet too short opening, as well as many arguments provoked by increasingly frustrated Hegelian Marxists during my, quote, year with Lukács outside formal political and academic setting. In particular, I'd like to thank comrades Mark Mulholland, Mike McNair, Lawrence Parker, Lori Rojas, and Lucy Parker. Lori Rojas was part of Platypus London when I was in the organization, so that's a name to note. So this was a debate between the CPTPP Provisional Committee and the Platypus Affiliate Society. And this was a decade ago, and this was when I was, this was written around the time I started moving away from the organization, focusing on my own projects, which at the time was being on the editorial team for the North Star magazine. But I was still in Platypus when this started, and I believe I was still in Platypus at this time. I was to leave a few months later. Finally, a note on sources, both out of necessity and for ease of source checking. I have referred to the Marxist Internet Archive and other internet sources where possible, the former containing a fairly complete set of Lukács' 1920 Risings, using the chapter and section headings where relevant. Lukács in context. It is perfectly commonplace starting point in a textual analysis to return a text to its context, yet it is perhaps particularly necessary to do so with history and class consciousness for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's a problem that Lukács codifies in his particular interpretation of his own context, quote, the vulgar Marxism of the Second International, which stubbornly persists amongst the far left today, and as a consequence to forms of historical thinking of Lukács' emergence as a thinker. Related to this first problem is the second. While it is useful and necessary to historically specify Lukács as a product of and an actor in his own time, the birth of the communist movement, the establishment and degeneration of the USSR, the ill-fated Hungarian Soviet Republic, etc., this does not exhaust the question. For Lukács, as he survives for us today, has a second life with the emergence of the 60s and 70s New Left. His persistence as a theoretical touchstone to this day is a product of the 1960s as much as the 1920s. Asterisk, yes. I mean, history and class consciousness was probably way more popular in the 60s and 70s than it was when it was actually published. And Lukács was often like a grand old man of like the New Left Review at the time too. So this is a very fair assertion. All right. His persistence as a theoretical touchstone to this day is a product as much of the 60s as much as the 1920s, not the least because it is the 60th generation of Marxists who are most and clearly indebted to him. Asterisk. We see this even in like stuff like standpoint epistemology being traced to Lukács at the end of the 1960s and 70s by people like Sandra Brown and Donna Haraway, etc. All right. So like Lukács was used in some pretty innovative, read eclectic ways. All right, back to text. The final issue raised has to do with Lukács' theoretical framework itself, for he views the theory as, in a certain sense, the crystallized self-consciousness of the historical moment, under capitalist society at least. If Lukács misrecognizes his historical calculation to which his text responds, then we must ask whether broader epistemological positions allow for a, quote, sympathetic critique, that is, whether his philosophical tools exist to reify mistakes within the universe of his thought, or whether it thereby descends into irresolvable and antinomies that demand instead a thorough break with his whole problematic. You can already see Turley's very influenced by the vocabulary of Althusser. All right. As far as the 1920s are concerned, we have to make a significant biological point at the outset. Lukács was not politically active in the socialist movement prior to 1917. This makes him almost unique amongst marquee names of revolutionary Marxism we have inherited from his time. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin were active in the Russian movement by 1905. Rosa Luxemburg, to whom two essays in history and class consciousness were directed, came into the socialist movement in the 1890s. A young Antonio Gramsci, the figure perhaps most closely analogous to Lukács, joined the Italian Socialist Party in 1913, and even Karl Korsch briefly flirted with all things with Fabianism at roughly the same time. Lukács' background, rather, was mainly academic. Passing through universities at Budapest, Berlin, and Heidelberg, his theoretical formation in the years prior to 1970 was primarily a deep engagement with German idealism, combined with the proto-existentialist thought of Fyodor Dostoevsky and Soren Kierkegaard. His peers during this time included two figures that haunt history and class consciousness, Georg Simmel and Max Weber. Both were to become influential sociologists, Weber most especially. I mean, he didn't think of himself as a sociologist, but yes. But there's a particular commitment that appears in both in different forms, which is of particular significance to the discussion of Lukács. Much of Weber's work is concerned with the increasing rationalization that pertains to modern capitalist society. The emphasis on rational calculation, the necessary condition from which business to law, these conclusions are essentially pessimistic. Capitalist society is one in which predictable mediocrities rather than brilliant individuals will thrive. Simmer, meanwhile, produced an important book, The Philosophy of Money, whose argument turns on the idea that the broader social relationship between individuals becomes objectified in monetary exchange. To the spiritual detriment of the individuals themselves, he calls this process reification. Lukács' sympathies up to this point could be called radical idealist, and he is often moved in socialistic circles. He had read George Sorel and Luxemburg by the end of the war. The revolution of 1970 jolted him into Marxism proper, but while the vast majority of the footnotes in history and class consciousness direct us to Marx, its theoretical coordinates were plotted under the influence of a great deal of contradictory thought, in a situation of rapid and unpredictable political ferment. In particular, the directly political content of history and class consciousness is indebted most heavily to the mass action of the left socialist movement, which hit its moment of greatest plausibility during the post-war, post-October revolutionary wave, which spread across Europe. Yet the book was published in 1922, at which time things were, to put it mildly, looking less rosy. The new situation led to the re-entrenchment and the political strategy of the Comintern. Through the policy of the United Front, and ultimately, a break with its left wing, sealed by its closure of the left-dominated West European Bureau in Amsterdam and the publication of Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder in 1920, a break with the increasingly delusional millenarianism of the ultra-left, however, failed to prevent the German Communist Party from embarking on the infamous 1921 March action, a disastrously voluntaristic stunt. In Lukács' native Hungary, meanwhile, things were equally looking grim. Having been propelled to power and formed the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919, the Communist Party rapidly ran into difficulties. A disastrous attempt to wage revolutionary war against Romania and Czechoslovakia, spearheaded by the Cahotic volunteerist Bela Kun, resulted rapidly in the regime's downfall. I actually know someone related to Bela Kun, so that's a funny story. Anyway, it was those who learned nothing from the Hungarian debacle who drove through the March action in Germany. In 1967, when the work of this period were finally republished in German, Lukács provided a sketch of a rather odd position all this left him in as a thinker. Quote, "My dilemma was to make even more acute by the fact that opposed to me within the leadership of the Hungarian party was a group led by Zinoviev's disciple, Bela Kun, who subscribed to the sectarianism of the modern bureaucratic type. In theory, it would have been possible to repudiate his views as those of a pseudo-leftist. In practice, however, his proposals could only be combined by an appeal to the highly prosaic realities of ordinary life that were, but distantly related to the larger perspectives of the world revolution. At this point in my life, as so often, I had a stroke of luck. The opposition of Bela Kun was headed by Eugen Landler, Landlord's influence which is focused on the immense political difficulties of building the Hungarian Communist Party and the conditions of generalized repression that followed the fall of the Soviet Republic, led to a particularly cognitive dissidence for Lukács, long quote. This had a particularly obvious early in 1921. On the Hungarian front, I followed Landler in advocating an energetic anti-sectarian line, while simultaneously at the international level, I gave theoretical support to the March action. With this tension between the conflicting tendencies reached a climax, as the division in the Hungarian party became more acute, as the movement of the radical workers in Hungary began to grow, my ideas were increasingly influenced by the theoretical tendencies brought into being by these events. However, they did not yet gain the upper limit at this stage, despite the fact that Lenin's criticism had undermined all my analysis of the March action. History and class consciousness is thought of as in some sense returning to an orthodox and revolutionary kernel of Marxism, stripping away the vulgar misreadings that had come encrusted in it. In fact, this classic writing is unorthodox, is the extreme, and our contemporary failure to see its eclecticism, a free-for-all mix of Marx and Engels, Simmel and Weber, Luxemburg and Sorel, Kant and Hegel, leads to many misunderstandings. In particular, its status as an expression of Lukács' philosophical volunteerism, rather than his, quote, realistic political activism, is not always recognized. It is a misunderstanding to which the 1968 generation is especially prone. The New Left sought to escape the bureaucratic diktat and stale inertia of the official communist movement without succumbing to the official social democracy. Many of them took things in the other direction, precisely towards the revival of the very same semi-anarchist mass action leftism that had informed history and class consciousness. This coincided with a great revival in Marxist philosophical discourse, especially of a Hegelian stripe, but also including a serious intellectual force, the radical anti-Hegelianism of Louis Althusser and his followers. Turley's an Althusser fan, I'm pretty sure. This was the time that Marx's earliest writing became available in foreign languages, and also the highly Hegelian Grundrisse, first published in German in 1939. The work of Lukács' followers gained currency. The Frankfurt School began to gain a major international audience, and in the case of Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, a serious influence on the radical movements. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, published in 1967, and also heavily relied on Lukácsian arguments. History and class consciousness in the Anglophone world thus acquired the mystique of a forgotten subversive classic by the time it was finally translated in full in 1971, which is the edition I have back there, by the way. It was found a ready audience that had already imbibed its fundamental theoretical premises through divergent sources. So we're already... One of the problems with these texts is a lot of times they're received after works influence them, have already changed their reading. And this is why I'm talking here, by the way. And because of that, we read later works into the early work and not in their own context, particularly when the translations come about. So this is translated relatively late and full. Like there were essays floating around in English, but the whole thing wasn't made available until 1971. Remember, it was written in the early 1920s. All right. 40 years later, still, Stalinism, which accounted for the spontaneous theory's instinctive appeal, is morally wounded, though it is proving a stubborn specter to exercise fully. Funny how in 2013 that it seems to be back, but without any mooring or any or that many real organizations. Just it's like it's been memeified. So, however, is a political strategy that history and class consciousness was most widely used to authorize at the time and still is today. An orientation towards mass action, which united semi-anarchists like the Borg with various sections of the Trotskyist movement, utterly failed to displace Stalinism and social democracy as hegemonic forces on the left. The death of one and the total depoliticization of the other have simply left nothing in their place. And Turley, you have no idea how bad that's going to get. In 10 years, it's going to get a lot worse. In this respect, and what follows, I take it for granted that the political strategy in its various guises, left communism, anarcho-syndicalism, Western Maoism, the Trotsky fetishism for the general strike, and spontaneism of the transitional program, has failed. Organizations based on that strategy have rarely, if ever, transcended the status of small and feeble sects, and the mass strike movement have repeatedly failed, via their own dynamics, to transcend the political forces dominant in the workers' movement, which Marxists in politics would expect to happen. Testing the viability of Lukács' thought, then, does not mean measuring the force which he makes the case for the strategy of encouraging spontaneous mass action, are the views of the Vanguard Party, which form an explicit part of the Leninist account of that strategy, and however much they deny it, an implicit part of the anarchist variants, back to the arch-conspirator Bakunin himself. It means asking whether we can think with Lukács a way out of this impasse. My view is that it is not possible to do so without a serious structural damage to his overall problematic. That the followers of Lukács have consequently divided all too neatly into political voluntarist activism projects and the academic theoretical pessimism, and that the conception of the Marx-Hegel relationship we have inherited from Lukács needs to be drastically rethought at the very least. A particular orthodoxy. Establishing this means starting at the beginning. The first page of History and Class Consciousness is as programmatic as the first page should be. The title of the first essay asks a question, what is Orthodox Marxism? And then proceeds immediately to answer it in one of Lukács' most widely quoted formulations. One quote, let us assume for the sake of argument that the recent research had discovered once and for all that every one of Marx's individual theses. Excuse me. Let me reread that. Let us assume for the sake of argument that the recent research had disproved once and for all every one of Marx's individual theses. Even if this were to be proved, every serious Orthodox Marxist would still be able to accept all such modern findings without reservation, and dismiss all of Marxist theses in toto without having to renounce his orthodoxy for a single moment. Asterisk, I have never found this convincing. The idea that you can abandon everything Marx concluded and still follow his methodology doesn't make sense to me. Never has. But nonetheless, Orthodox Marxism therefore does not imply an uncritical acceptance of the results of Marxist investigations. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, nor the exegesis of a sacred book. On the contrary, the orthodoxy refers exclusively to a method. It is a scientific conviction that the dialectical materialism is the road to truth, and that its method can be developed, expanded, and deepened only along the lines laid down by its founders. It is the conviction, moreover, that all attempts to surpass or improve it have led and must lead to oversimplification, triviality, and eclecticism. The rest of this chapter attempts to answer the question that Lukács most obviously begs here. What then is the method? And we know fairly quickly what it is not. Any insistence on the part of the would-be Marxist, with the Greg Grein and C.P. Scott, that facts are sacred in and of themselves, taking a firm stand on the empirical. The word facts appears a good number of times in these 20 or so pages, about half the time in scare quotes. For Lukács, the problem is the fact that we, to borrow an Althuserian phrase, already have been incorporated in the overall Weltanschauung. The blinkered empiricists will, of course, deny the facts, only become facts in the framework of a system, which will vary with the knowledge desired. In doing so, he forgets, however a simple enumeration of facts may be, however lacking in commentary, it already implies an interpretation. Already at this stage, facts have been comprehended by a theory and method. They have been wrenched from their living context and fitted into a theory. The decisive importance of the method is thus docked at precisely the point where it necessarily is posed. Instead of simply enumerating facts or, quote, facts, we need to have some way of determining what facts mean. And in fact, so to speak, we should have to object here. Outside of the Dickensian character, even the most blinkered empiricist would accept this complaint at face value and refer Lukács to the scientific method. The blinkers in the case amount to a vulgar understanding of the particularities of science. Lukács has his own thing to say on this point later on. Method, instead, is the dialectical method, and the dialectical method is to be understood as essentially Hegelian, while, quote, cloaked and abstracted in a misunderstanding. In this view, Hegel makes the necessary essential point underlying the whole dialectic. Necessity consists in this, that the whole is sundered into different concepts, and that it is divided whole yields a fixed and permanent determination. However, this is not fossilized determinacy, but one which permanently recreates itself in dissolution, unquote. Lukács comments, quote, that the deep affinities between historical materialism and Hegel's philosophy are clearly manifested here, for both conceive of theory as self-knowledge of reality. Paragraph 5, instance added. The difference between the two consists in that ultimately Hegel was not Hegelian enough. Something I'll hear from Zizek later. Quote, Marx reproached Hegel, and in even stronger terms, Hegel's successors who reverted to Kant and Fichte, with his failure to overcome the duality of thought and being, of theory and practice, of subject and object. His knowledge is no more than knowledge about an essentially alien material. It was not the case that this material human society came to know itself. Paragraph 4. This is one of the central points in history and class consciousness to which Lukács will return with pedantic regularity. The political and theoretical project of Marxism is directed at overcoming the binary oppositions enumerated here, which are themselves more than simple theoretical errors. This bifurcation, as we shall see, is the objective affliction within the structure of capitalism as a social system. The failure of the German philosophers to overcome the classic antinomies of Kantianism is something that has to be resolved in historical reality. The other central axiom of Lukács' framework opens the second essay, quote, the Marxism of Rosa Luxemburg. Quote, it is not the primacy of the economic motives and historical explanations that constitutes the decisive difference between Marxism and bourgeois thought, but the point of view of totality. Paragraph 1. This is a big point in platypus affiliated society. This is why they will not focus as much as many other Marxist groups on the economic thought of Marxism. They focus on it none, and they focus a lot on the economic thought of Smith and Ricardo, and to a lesser degree, Frankfurt School thinker Friedrich Pollock. That's where Platypus really gets a lot of its economic theory from, in so much that it has it articulated. So the claim that it said they don't care about it at all is not true, but they use, I think, the locus of debate here is moving away from the economism of the Second International towards the primacy of the totality of Marx's history. Now, what this means is going to be rather vague. We'll get to that in the case of Platypus and Crescatron, as also in Lukács, but it is what is being argued here. The question is, what does this have to do with Marxism? And the answer right now is, well, most Marxist theory after 1960 incorporates this into it. Okay, like the residual Kantianism of bourgeois thought, Lukács' critique is structured around binary oppositions, but of a rather different type. The totality is opposed as a standpoint, this is where standpoint epistemology comes from, by the way, to the isolated fact or individual. The concrete is read as the fact which comprehended in fullness of its determinations, as opposed to the abstract, which is sundered from them. The opposition between the active and the complainant maps onto this pattern as well, leading to some counterintuitive usages elsewhere in the text. Lurking behind them is the daddy of them all, the opposition in Hegel between Verstand and Vernunft, the understanding and reason proper. This then is a method which is the yardstick of orthodoxy. To grasp the totality, which, however, cannot be done as a theoretical exercise, but consists in bringing the, quote, alien material to self-consciousness. This poses two theoretical requirements. Lukács must establish that the self-knowledge of reality he proposes is indeed materially rooted in that reality, and he must account for the equally stubborn reality of false consciousness. Both are the task of the central essays of history and class consciousness. On the first point, Lukács raises an argument whose influence has become increasingly baleful and intractable in the theoretical work sense. Pre-capitalist societies are characterized by a qualitatively different relation to their division into classes than capitalist societies. They are, in the first instance, less cohesive. Quote, The various parts are much more self-sufficient and less closely interrelated. In certain circumstances, the state, i.e., the organized unity, remains insecurely anchored in the real life of society. One sector of society simply lives out its natural existence and what amounts to a total independence of the fate of the state. Class consciousness, paragraph 2. As a consequence, the division of society appears natural and appears as so many states and castes rather than classes as we know them today. The unstable and essentially arbitrary relationship between the economic and juridical life occludes true class consciousness completely. Long quote, again from Lukács. In Hegel's parlance, the economy has not even objectively reached the stage of being for itself. There is therefore no possible position within such a society from which the economic basis of all social relations can be made conscious. Capitalist society is quite the opposite. Quote, there is an unbridgeable gulf between this and capitalism, where economic factors are not concealed behind consciousness, but are present in consciousness itself, albeit unconsciously are repressed. With capitalism, with the abolition of feudal estates and the creation of society with a purely economic articulation, class consciousness arrives at the point where it could become conscious. We should stress there is nothing novel in Lukács in stressing the difference between capitalists and previous modes of production. Indeed, a brief popular account can be found in the Communist Manifesto itself. Lukács' argument is rather more radical, however. Capitalist modernity introduces a whole new structure of consciousness and does so through a completely saturation of society by the economy. The economic categories are thus not simply mental phenomenon, but the very mode of being in capitalist society. The class nature of pre-capitalist societies is only made visible by the methods of historical materialism. This adds a reflective twist to his argument about method. The self-consciousness of reality is only possible at certain stages of that reality. Quote, the scientific convention that dialectical materialism is the road to truth is a historical expression of a mode of production which comes retroactively to include its predecessors in terms of its self-consciousness. Within this framework, keeping the idea of the underlying historical dynamics alive because of increasingly fraught, this can be illustrated, though an earlier discussion in Orthodox Marxism chapter of the question of the separation of movement and the ultimate goal, quote, the ultimate goal is not, this can be illustrated through an earlier discussion in the Orthodox Marxism question of the separation of movement and the ultimate goal. Quote, the ultimate goal is not a state of the future awaiting the proletariat somewhere independent of the movement and the path leading up to it, he states, rebuking the likes of Bernstein. Quote, the ultimate goal is rather the relation to the totality, to the whole of society, seems as a process through which every aspect of the struggle acquires its revolutionary significance. Paragraph 5. This would appear on the face of it to be a straightforwardly teleological account of history. In fact, however, it's teleological in a much more ambiguous sense, which again flows from the underlying Hegelian methodology. In Hegel, as in a little sketch of Lukács, the genesis, the process, and the teleos are an indivisible unity, pure being. The first section of logic already contains the absolute idea, which in turn contains being and the whole philosophical machinery that separates the two in actual exposition. We are accustomed to think of Hegel as restoring a dynamic of historical development to philosophy, but we should in fact be much more cautious. To use the structuralist terminology, Hegelian philosophy is synchronic rather than diachronic. It is a machine whose parts coexist and develop logically from one another, rather than in a forward temporal motion. The homology between this and Lukács' account of the teleos is striking. The past becomes irrevocably alien, except in so much as it is afforded a precarious existence within the eternal present. Secretly, the historical timeline itself is cast out of theory. We should stress that he is not necessarily wrong to do so. In any case, the overarching drift in the hyper-Hegelian Marxism has been in this direction, rather in Chris Author's systemic dialectic interpretation of capital of Moshe Postone's account of the radical difference of modernity and the self-moving subject of capital. Reification, section 3. Self-consciousness is posed as a possibility uniquely for capitalist society. How should it come about has to do with a manner in which economic categories come to dominate consciousness. Here we turn to the longest essay in the collection, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. Lukács is here at his most original, which again has to be stressed, as aspects at least of the theory he propounds are widely misrecognized as straightforward Marxist orthodoxy. The first part of the essay, the phenomenon of reification, starts with the commodity form. Indeed, quote, it is no accident that Marx should have begun with the analysis of commodities when, in the two great works of his mature period, he set out to portray capitalist society in its totality and to lay bare its fundamental nature. For at this stage in history of mankind, there is no problem that does not ultimately lead back to that question, and there is no solution that could not be found in the solution to the riddle of the commodity structure. Unquote. This consciousness under capitalism consists in a structural typology of the effects of the commodity form on mental life. It begins with the theory of the commodity fetishism. Quote, a relation between people takes on the character of a thing and thus acquires a phantom objectivity, an autonomy that seems so strictly rational and all-embracing as to conceal every trace of its fundamental nature, the relations between people. The phantom objectivity of the commodity form then goes on to take on a significance far beyond the rather limited role it plays in capital itself. That is, designating a particular socially necessary misrecognition in capitalist society, accounting for the concealment of social relationships from the bourgeois political economy on one hand, and of the exploitation of the working class on the other. In fact, Lukács' great innovation here is to produce a hybrid out of Marxist theory of commodity fetishism, Weber's theory of rationalization, and Semmel's theory of reification. Through Weber, Lukács argues that the commodity production, above all, institutes the domination of the quantitative, the rule of equivalence and calculability, the rational instrumentalization of all human activity. Their necessity to the capitalist economy is obvious, simply in terms of deciding levels of production, buying enough inputs, calculating market prices, organizing labor efficiently, etc. Yet this quickly becomes, in this account, the general rule throughout society. The state machine becomes reified. A faceless bureaucracy grows, in which the bureaucrat comes to preserve identification with a specific duty. The law becomes reified, and here he quotes Weber in fine sarcastic form directly. For those modern businesses with their fixed capital and their exact calculations are much too sensitive to the legal administrative irrationalities, they could only come into being in the bureaucratic state with its rational laws, where the judge is more or less an automatic statute dispensing machine, in which you insert the files together with the necessary costs and dues at the top, whereupon he will eject the judgment together with the more or less cogent reasons for it at the bottom. That is to say, where the judge's behavior is on the whole predictable. This is where like abstract domination seems to come from. This is Varn talking. The effects of the consciousness of rational mechanization are various. For bureaucracy, it is the pretty Kantian aforementioned love of duty, the quote specific form of bureaucratic consciousness. For the worker, the situation is a more painful split. Quote, with the modern psychological analysis of the work process and Taylorism, this rational mechanism extends right into the worker's soul. Even his psychological attributes are separated from his total personality and placed in opposition to it so as to facilitate integration of special rationalized system and their reduction to statistically viable concepts. Here, primarily, is the influence of Semmel, a spiritual existential critique of capitalism with a clear romantic inflection emerges, although the substance of the argument does not turn on it directly. Rational mechanization, however, turns into its opposite. The laws of motion of a partial systems are rationalized to the last detail by capitalism. But reification includes a rational understanding of the totality. The systemic exclusion of the qualitative, its violent reduction in what can be rationally measured, cannot be achieved in reality. The underlying irrationality of the system is exposed by crisis, which stems from the representation of the qualitative nature of things, the use value as opposed to the value of commodities, which is stubbornly turns out to matter after all. Yet this too penetrates the whole of society. Bureaucracy is rationalized, but anyone who has ever made any contact with bureaucracy will recognize the underlying irrationality. The tendency to departmental warfare and generalized chaos, pointed out wryly by Lukács here. Likewise, while the judge may be reduced to a statute dispensing machine, the laws themselves, in their qualitative nature, interrupt irrationally into society. Lukács quotes learned jurist. Quote from Lukács. With regard to the origins of law, critical jurist Kelsen observes, subquote, it is the great mystery of law and the state that is consummated with the enactment of laws, and for this reason it may be permissible to employ inadequate images in elucidating its nature, end quote. Or, in other words, long quote, long subquote, it is symptomatic of the nature of the law that a norm may be legitimate even if its origins are iniquitous. That is another way of saying that legitimate origins of the law cannot be written into a concept of the law as one of its conditions. The second part of the essay is essentially an extension of the argument of the first to the domain of classical German philosophy, specifically Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, where reification is pushed to its highest limits. The same fundamental split between rational knowledge and irrational excess that escapes it is traced through a whole of insurmountable obstacles, primarily the Kantian unknowability of the thing in itself. This limit is chased around the houses. Ethics and aesthetics are all proposed as potential reconciliations of the fundamental split. Finally, with Hegel, we get some serious nudge in the direction of a solution. History itself, conceived as a dialectical process, becomes a grounds for grasping the totality and bringing the thing in itself into consciousness. Yet Hegel's system is secretly contemplative itself. History is already completed, its steps and modes already integrated in the historical system. The ruse of reason, the hour of Minerva, are all attempts to get around the problem that history is not conceived as, quote, human sensuous activity, to use Marxist terms in the theses on Feuerbach. What results is a conceptual mythology whose resolution of the subject-object problem is ultimately false, long quote. Since the method, having become abstract and contemplative, now, as a result, falsifies and does violence to history, it follows that history will gain revenge and violate the method which has failed to integrate it, tearing it up to pieces. Paragraph 4. If the conceptual mythologies of the classical German philosophers fail to grasp the totality, we must return to the first demand above. By what means can historical consciousness be achieved? The rest of the essay provides an answer in the standpoint of the proletariat. This is where standpoint theory comes from, guys. He begins with Marx's lapidary account. Quote, when the proletariat proclaims the dissolution of the previous world order, it does no more than reveal the secret of its own existence, for it represents the effective dissolution of that world order. The property-owning class and the class of the proletariat represents the same self-alienation, but the former feels at home in the alienation and feels itself confined by it. It recognizes alienation as its own instrument, and in it possesses the semblance of a human existence. The latter feels itself destroyed by this alienation and sees in it its own impotence and the reality of inhuman existence. This citation is from the Holy Family, and at the height of Marx's Feuerbachian phase, and is redolent of that period when, as Engels remarked somewhere, we were all Feuerbachians. There is a more pertinent issue, which has to do with the way Lukács brings the proletariat here, which is it is substantially subjectivist. That is, its bite comes from the experience of the inherent alienation felt by historical individuals in their situation. It is because the proletariat experiences alienation as an intolerable that it can, quote, reveal the secret of its own existence. That is, that capitalism is not the consummation of reason in history, but rather another self-alienation of a human species being, and thereby represent the abolition of capitalism. Lukács goes on to specify the argument a little further, which needs to be quoted at length. So, long quote from Lukács. This enables us to understand why it is solely in the proletariat that the process by which man's achievement is split off from his total personality and becomes a commodity leads to a revolutionary consciousness. Ellipses. The basic structure of reification can be found in all the social forms of modern capitalism, i.e., bureaucracy, but the structure can only be fully made conscious in the work situation of the proletariat. For his work, as he experiences it directly, possesses the naked and abstract form of the commodity, while in other forms of work, this is hidden inside the facade of mental labor, responsibility, etc. Corresponding with the objective concealment of the commodity form, there is a subjective element. That is the fact that while the process by which the worker is reified and becomes a commodity dehumanizes him and cripples and anthropizes his soul, as long as he does not consciously rebel against it, it remains true that precisely his humanity and his soul are not changed into commodities. He is able, therefore, to objectify himself completely against his existence, while the man reified in the bureaucracy, for instance, is turned into a commodity, mechanized and reified in the only faculties that might enable him to rebel against his reification. Even his thoughts and feelings become reified. While the first paragraph here is specified at the beginning of the second as an objective argument, it is in fact subjective. The inability of the bureaucrat, or the journalist, from whom Lukács' contempt is truly withering, to comprehend the reality of the commodity form comes from the existential situation in which he finds himself in, by virtue of his entire soul becomes reified. But the work situation of the worker, who experiences reification in the form of his productive labor processes, results instead in his productive capacities being split from his total personality. Thus, he conceives of his labor power as a commodity, as something he sells. The consequence of this is that the veil of the fetishism reification is torn aside. The worker becomes conscious of his own objectivity. In the historical situation saturated by the commodity form, the commodity itself becomes self-conscious. The worker is no longer subject to the split between the subjective and objective. His subjectivity is able to grasp the objectification inherent in his situation. Thus, the working class becomes for itself, the famous identical subject-object of history. Paragraph 6. The limits of Lukács. The third part of reification consists of a dense, complex argument. It is probable best thought of as the votio performance of the task which, sooner or later, afflicts all those with a critical theoretical consciousness, philosophizing oneself out of a hole. He has, after all, dug a very deep hole, deep enough to hold the fate of all humanity inside it. From commodity fetishism, and Marx has a specific point in the overall argument. We have arrived at reification as a total existential condition, which consumes a good portion of the species completely and confronts a larger one with a more limited colonial incursions into the soul. In his critique of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, however, he has dug a hole for himself alone. He accuses the German philosophers, after all, of reified conceptions of history. History becomes abstractly a matter of human action, but ultimately subject to the rules of reason, the laws of unintended consequences, as post facto philosophies of history are possible. So, as well as providing the objective ground for historical consciousness and the objective ground for historical false consciousness, Lukács has a third task, to do so without falling in conceptual mythology himself. On the basis of the book's argument up to this point, it cannot be said that he does. The first problem that has to be mentioned is that, in the long passage quoted above, distinguishing the subject positions of the proletarian and the bureaucrat, he makes a substantively different argument from the historical importance of the working class rather than that of Marx and classical pre-war Marxism more generally. Marx, on the whole, is more conscious about making positive arguments concerning the inheritance of communism to the working class, the inherence of communism to the working class, rather than stemming from the positive phenomenological experience of alienation and exploitation. He points to the lack of property in the means of production, that is, the double freedom which capital made so famous. The proletariat's class power has thus fundamentally relies on collective action, which, however, is quite true as for most sectional trade union disputes as it is for the social revolution. Lukács' argument, on the other hand, is workerist or economist in the narrow sense. That is, contra Lenin Koninkowski, in the most infamous part of what is to be done, socialist consciousness is to be found in a direct struggle between the worker and the employer. This has a constricting effect on our conception of the working class, at least implicitly for Marx and classical Marxism. Those who do not work for a wage as such, but who belong to the class of people reliant on the social wage fund as a whole, the unemployed, housewives, school-age, working class children, etc., are quite as much proletarians as their horny handed sons of toil in the factories. And it is the unity of all these strata which poses a mortal threat to the bourgeois order. Yet, on this line of argument, Lukács cannot avoid the conclusion of broadly this type. Having presented capitalist society as one of purely economic articulation, and thus the economic categories as the very forms in which we live, our relations to the world, the only way out is to find some decisive type of phenomenal experience from which point society can become self-consciousness. The proletariat as a whole, including homemakers, the unemployed, etc., cannot be the subject to sufficiently similar phenomenology. And so one stratum must be privileged if the dissolution of the existing social order is to be the work of the proletariat at all. But suppose we accept Lukács' argument on this point, the beautifully poised argument that brings us from the fatal a priori of German philosophy to the proletarian subject-object is, on the face of it, precisely a conceptual mythology of the order of Hegel's system. It works whether or not proletariat actually does achieve such consciousness. Indeed, whether or not the proletariat exists or not, it thus falls prey to Kant's critique of the ontological argument for the existence of God, let alone his arguments about the conceptual mythologies of history. It is clear from the empirical record that while the masses of workers have been won to the idea of their exploitation as systemic in nature and will continue until the end of the commodity society, proletarian class struggle may equally, in its defensive form, take place under consummately fetish slogan, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and thus remain stuck in its unconscious objectivity. Lukács attacks this problem from two sides, either side of the reification essay. In fact, in class consciousness, he proposes the concept of impugned, I don't know how to say it, surregnant class consciousness borrowed from Weber. On this conception, class consciousness consists in the fact of an appropriate and rational reactions imputed to a particular typical position in the process of production. Paragraph 1. With this caveat, the consciousness of the proletariat becomes a potentiality inherent in the life world of the class, present even in situations where it is not actualized as such. In the 1967 preface, however, Lukács puts his finger on exactly what is wrong with this ingenious procedure, and it's precisely what leaves him as stuck in the conceptual mythology as ever. Long quote. What I intended subjectively, and what Lenin had arrived at as a result of an authentic Marxist analysis of a practical movement, was transformed into my account into a purely intellectual result, and thus into something contemplative. In my presentation, it would indeed be a miracle if imputed consciousness could turn into revolutionary praxis. It is through a certain Lenin that Lukács will again attempt to dig his way out. The final essay, Towards the Methodology of the Problem of Organization, however, is theoretically cautious and in obvious tension with the overall analysis. It is hardly surprising that de Boer, for example, rejected out of hand without any serious conceptual difficulties. Most of the essay is, innocently or otherwise, simply unconcerned with resolving the central issue. That is, making the argument for the party as a form which mediates between theory and practice. The bulk, however, is based rather obtuse philosophalizations of the Leninist party from which emerges in the early Comintern. In this respect, some arguments are perceptive and illuminating, paragraph 3, on the relationship between discipline and bourgeois individual freedom in particular. Others simply recapitulate classic mass action arguments against the Second International Center, albeit obscured by Hegelian jargon. So why the Communist Party? He proposes that a party is necessary, first of all, because it is purely proletarian revolution is impossible. That is, sections of broad masses will need to be brought in by a conscious work of an organization rather than a spontaneous mass action, something missed even by Lukács' beloved Rosa Luxemburg. Long quote. Only in class consciousness of the proletariat do we find the correct view of the revolutionary action is so deeply anchored and so deeply rooted in the instincts that this attitude need only be made conscious for it to provide a clear lead. Action will then advance of itself along the right road. If, however, other strata of the population become decisively involved in the revolution, they may advance it under certain circumstances. But it is just as easy for them to deflect it into a counter-revolutionary direction. For the class situation of these strata, petite bourgeoisie, peasants, oppressed nationalities, etc., there is nothing, nor can be anything, to make their action lead inevitably towards a proletarian revolution. The second argument, that consciousness is not homogeneous among the proletariat either. Our aim here is to point that class consciousness of the proletariat does not develop uniformly throughout the whole proletariat, parallel with the objective economic crisis. Large sections of the proletariat remain intellectually under the tutelage of the bourgeoisie. Even the severest economic crises fail to shake them in their attitude, with the result that the standpoint of the proletariat and its reaction to the crisis is much less violent and intense than the crisis itself. These arguments are, ironically, perfectly cogent from the point of view of the empirical record, although they do not begin to exhaust the party question. These disputes among the Russian Social Democrats and figures like Rosa Luxemburg do indeed turn to a large degree on the problem of non-proletarian masses and the relationship of the Workers' Party are to have with those masses. The war, meanwhile, made it perfectly clear that sections of the workers' movement could be turned to the tutelage of the bourgeoisie, of which Lenin's theory of imperialism is only the most famous account. Within the schema of Lukács's overall philosophy, however, taken with the imputed class consciousness, they become quite problematic. The link between the subjective existential situation of the industrial proletariat and its revolutionary class consciousness, on which the final dialectical leap of reification turns, is more or less decisively broken. Proletarian class consciousness thus has to lie elsewhere, in the party. The ability of the Communist Party to embody the consciousness is not rooted in anything about its objective situation. It is whether a matter will, the ability of the individual member to submit to the discipline, and the ability of the party to intervene decisively in spontaneous mass actions, unlike the passive social democratic parties. Lukács's reasoning here is a theoretical shortcut producing a barely convincing leap between the imputed consciousness, somehow inherently rooted in the reality of which it is conscious, even if only as a potentiality, and an arbitrarily given historical collection of conscious individuals. The road to a political voluntarism is hereby laid out. Yet so is the road to disillusionment. When voluntaristic politics fail, the result, whether or not it is more delusional voluntarism, the degeneration of various new left sects into urban guerrilla outfits, for example, is pessimism. The short circuit is a symptom of a larger one, itself nested in the manner of a Matryoshka doll, inside the decisive overall problem of method. The larger problem is buried in the reification essay. It appears that his argument here is impeccably dialectical in the strict Hegelian sense. The first part begins with a simple concept, the commodity, and develops the account of a sharp and irresolvable contradiction. The second part, through its analysis of classical German philosophy, derives that contradiction to its highest and most unbearable intensity. The third resolves the contradiction to a higher unity, the active consciousness of the identical subject-object. However, we are entitled to ask, why on earth should a commodity have such an extraordinary power to colonize everything? In order to ensure its continued existence as a mode of production, capitalism needs to return enough people to work every day to reproduce themselves, as well as a parasitic class of exploiters on top of them. It does not need to colonize everyone's soul. In fact, it has been much happier in a good many situations to leave the job to the priest and the secular inheritors such as the mass media, who will, after all, know one or two things about colonizing souls. And Lukács's all-conquering power of the commodity is simply assumed. It is a perfectly rational assumption on the basis of Hegelian idealism, where the totality is embodied homogeneously across its particular elements. Althusser in his school called this the expressive totality, and it can be crudely likened to a stick of Brighton rock. Whatever you break it, the same message is written on in the cross section. There are serious difficulties that arise from Althusser's critique of this conception of totality, which we cannot go into here. Nonetheless, the prognosis he offers is pertinent. The various instances of society, the different spheres in which that complicated animal we call human has its existence, lose their own specificity. They become reducible, one and all, via various degrees of mediation to a single principle. Heads I win. But this principle, in the cruel tryst of the dialectic, is condemned to lose its explanatory power. If commodity fetishism reification accounts for the stupidities of both Mitt Romney and Joseph Ratzinger, then it cannot provide a satisfactory account for either. Varn says, bingo! If you explain everything by a reduction to one thing, you have effectively explained nothing, because it is an undifferentiated expression of a singular form of the totality. And being undifferentiated, it has no explanatory process. I mean, I could get this from fucking Hegel himself, actually. So this is a problem. This led to what I like to call the Marxist bootstraps theory, where you come up with an impossible totality, but which the proletariat can pull itself up by its own bootstraps while being subject and product of that very totality. So yes, commodification affects all elements of your life. That's what totality means. And I'm not willing to throw away. I think if you throw away totality, you actually do throw away some key points of Marx. Then maybe we throw that away and you just admit you're throwing that away from Marx. But you have to admit here that having one totality explain everything doesn't actually give it any explanatory power. It just makes it like the universal substance, like motion, or if your hair collides fire or something. All right. We are forced one way or another to rely on external theoretical resources. The conscious incorporation of certain Freud and another Nietzsche into the analysis of the Frankfurt School is a relatively moderate example. Literary critic Friedrich Dramus's assumption of almost every passing trend in contemporary academia accounts for much of the reified partial systems. Post-structuralism is a necessary expression of the particularity of postmodernity, or late capitalism, for example, is a far more extreme one. Within the framework of this analysis, however, distinguishing between legitimate historicizations and theoretical opportunism is epistemologically impossible. The method in which Orthodox Marxism is somehow embodied is entirely circular and self-sufficient. Facts cannot intrude on the problem, for they are themselves only comprehensible through method. Science, which is certainly the traditional answer for Marx and Engels, cannot either. Lukács, in his brief excursus entitled Subject and Object in Hegel, experienced a scientific passage in Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, and the end of classical German philosophy. Long quote. The most telling refutation of this, that is, the questioning of the possibility of any cognition, or at least the exhaustive cognition of the world, JT, as all other philosophical crochets, is practice, namely the experiment in industry. And if we are able to prove the correctness of our conception of a natural process by making it ourselves, bringing it into being out of its conditions and making it serve our own purposes into the bargain, then there is an end to the ungraspable Kantian thing in itself. The chemical substances produced in the bodies of plants and animals remain such things in themselves until the organic chemistry began to produce them one after the other, whereupon the thing in itself became a thing for us. This is an unacceptable statement from Lukács' point of view. Quote, Engels' deepest misunderstanding consists in his belief that the behavior of industry and scientific experiment constitutes a practice in the dialectical philosophical sense. In fact, scientific experiment is contemplation at its purest. The experimental creates an artificial, abstract milieu in order to be able to observe undisturbed, untrampled workings of laws under examination, eliminating all irrational factors, both of the subject and the object. Emphasis added by. The method is justified rather, and it is an expression of historical self-consciousness. Quote, the genius and history should coincide, and more exactly, that they should be different aspects of the same process, can only happen if the two conditions are fulfilled. On one hand, all categories in which human existence is constructed must appear as determinants of that existence itself, and not merely of the description of that existence. On the other hand, their succession, their coherence, and their connection must appear as aspects of the historical process itself, as a structural impairment of the present. Reification, Part 3, Paragraph 2. There are thus no meanings available for the correction. Two divergent theoretical formations cannot confront each other on the ground of a third party, the dreaded facts, about which the discussion would then be possible, because facts are openly or secretly method to begin with. They cannot confront each other over the result of industry and experiment, which are themselves contemplation at its purest, and therefore reified in extremis. They are only the two conditions above, which already assume the Hegelian expressive totality. It is a perfect circle. Heads I win, tails you lose. On the basis of this exposition, Orthodox Marxism comes exactly what Lukács, back in his opening passages, says it is not. Orthodox Marxism, therefore, cannot imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations, but his view of Marx's method, which is surely a result of his investigations, must be accepted uncritically. Gareth Stedman Jones, in his lengthy critique of class consciousness in history, wonders what kind of method could survive the falsification of its results. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, but the method only works if we accept the thesis that capitalism is a society of purely economic articulation in which commodity form saturates all human relations. Nor is it an exegesis of a sacred book, but almost all of Lukács' references are from either the first chapter of Capital or the earliest available works of the time, a characteristic that has become, if anything, far more acute in the theoretical work of the Hegelian Marxist right since the 1960s. It is the Hegelian commitment that renders this view circular. Hegel's system works in the first instance because it does not distinguish, except as logical moments in systemic exposition, history and nature. In that respect, human existence can be read as self-sufficient totality with strictly endogenous laws of development. Lukács rejects Engels' theory of the dialectics of nature in order to square this circle. By the way, Lukács is pretty much the first place where I find the Engels bad, Marx good stuff you see so common in the New Left and used even by people like Cohost, which tries to use Lukács in a way completely alien to Lukács to make Lukács talk about climate crisis and environmental crisis, where Lukács is clearly not. Sato just basically uses Lukács as a ventriloquist dummy to use him as a ventriloquist dummy for Marx to posit him against Engels, and then make some references to mega research that his currently published work doesn't prove, and goes through the same thing that the New Left does, the Vera Sassulich letters, the fragment on machines, parts of the Gردessa, to make the same arguments the New Left does, but in new ways. And I think it's horse poop, but we get this from Lukács. In fact, a lot of stuff that Marxists have fight with, including Marxists at Platypus affiliated societies, such as Standpoint Epistemology, are taken by late New Left approximations of Lukács. See, might talk about Sandra Brown and Donna Haraway in the beginnings of feminist Standpoint epistemology, where they eventually leave Marxism and drop all the Marxism out of this, but keep the totality standpoint stuff to justify that oppressed peoples always know the answer to their own problems because of their qualia or qualitative experience, and removes it from any structure or structural realization or quantitative experience. Those are seen as false impositions. Well, you can see how this argument can be related to what's articulated here. And Turley lays this out. That's the problem. All right. In that respect, human existence can be read as self-sufficient totality with strict endogenous laws of development. Lukács rejects Engels' theory of dialectics of nature in order to square the circle, and thus rebukes Hegel for providing the lead for Engels. His alternative to this view is to declare nature a societal category. In this way, self-sufficient totality of human history can be preserved. Yet it comes at the cost of a wholesale lapse into idealism. A given conception of nature, it is true, is determined as a social category. Nature, however, is not a category. Nature is a brute fact. No scare quotes here. An incomprehensibly complex assembly of matter, energy, and empty space, whose laws of motion obtain in cruel indifference to what we tailless apes happen to think about the matter. The human race is part of nature and is in a state of complete dependence on the non-human parts of it. Marx speaks of the metabolic relationship between the two and castigates the authors of the 1875 Goethe program of the German social democracy for failing to consider that dependency. His rare-known citation of Vico, human history differs from natural history in this, that we have made the former, but not the latter, is referred to by Lukács, who, however, seems to miss its overall significance. It is not the case that Hegel's method has simply gotten lost in the wrong subject matter and can provide a model for materialist analysis where the relevant names change. The methodological assumption of the homogeneous totality with the wholly endogenous laws of motion must either produce a, quote, unified field theory that encompasses all physical phenomenon in which we humans play at most an insignificant role, or otherwise collapse into idealism. And I also accused Platypus Affiliate Society of collapsing into idealism, and it was Lukács. That's why I did it. Although my reading at the time was nowhere advanced as Turley's, and I was to read this actually and trying to get a grip on Lukács when I read this all those years ago. The political result today of holding to the expressive Hegelian methodology is ultimately the revenge of the subject-object dichotomy. Inheritors of Lukács, on one hand, consist of various forms of volunteerism. The combination of the absolute structure of ideology and the weak point at the point of production leads to an obsessive focus on precisely mass action. This is the very obvious in the anarchist autonomous and so formed forms of direct action and fetishization of the wildcat strike. Yet it should also be stressed that there are right-wing forms of this too. The classical Socialist Workers' Party line of moderate demands, militant action, in some sense, is linked to the Hegelian heritage. While the SWP has never been formally committed to the Lukácsian Hegelian Marxism, it began translations of history and class consciousness in the mid-1960s. And former leader John Rees is a committed Hegelian Marxist. Despite Kalinikos's background in analytical philosophy and Althusserianism, philosophical discussions at the annual Marxism Festival remain basically of a Hegelian stripe. A video of Chris Neiman talking at Counterfire event is paradigmatic, in which he ends up arguing that the struggle over lunch breaks can present an obstacle to commodification. The result? It does not matter how right-wing politics you put over it actually are, but only that people get excited. I think you can come to this error from more than just Lukács. I think a lot of Maoists do this too. That just anything is popular and that people get excited about must be real. See, MAGA communist as well. And that it must have some reality outside of the specific historical instantiation, aka the speeches of Trump and the weird cult of personality that has emerged from that. So that you can assume that just because it's popular, it's right. Yeah, which Lenin doesn't assume. Marx sure as fuck doesn't assume. All right. And then on the other side of the object, there are those for whom the arguments for proletarian cross consciousness are simply unconvincing for one reason or the other. For example, the followers of the Frankfurt School, for whom the administrative society spread reification throughout, such that resistance can only take the form of critical theory. Until it seems some kind of incomprehensible cosmic catastrophe returns revolution to the historical agenda. And at the extreme end, we find Marxists too following the argument that Marxism is an account of strictly of the logic of capitalist society, decry historical materialism as a religion because it supposedly imputes a purported dynamic to history. All that can be done in the exposition of a theory of value to whatever individuals will listen. Finally, under the same general stripe, there is a domestication of various forms of Hegelian Marxism in academia. It has become increasingly esoteric arguments over value theory and capital logic are cultural criticism of a Jameson. This is not a contingent historical result with determinations exogenous to the Hegelian theoretical framework, which would, however, be quite unable to theorize such determinations anyway, but an irresolvable antinomy that results from holding the stick of rock view of society. The message down to the middle either reads proletarian revolution or perpetual domination. Ouch. And this was what I was talking about reading Alvin Gouldner's book, which I did as both the first chapter for this public show and the rest of the book as a reading group on the back end. And the rest of the book goes a little crazy, but it does point out that there is a tendency of this kind of voluntarism that you particularly see in Lukács to turn on itself and become pessimistic in the way that Lukács criticizes the Frankfurt School for doing. I mean, the Frankfurt School thinks that the reification is so thorough that even the workers themselves have committed to their own oppression and thus are no longer really viable as revolutionary subjects. And this leads to the new revolutionary subject search, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not even getting to the weirdness of French critical theory, which, whoa. But nonetheless, this is where this goes. All right. Now, why? And Turley seems to make a good argument that this is part of the problem of the logic, that there's a contradiction in the logic here. And that it actually makes elements of what Lukács is arguing nonsensical. All right, Marxism and philosophy. If a strictly Hegelian methodology standpoint cannot be sustained without falling into incoherence, the question is inevitably raised as the status of philosophy and Marxism. I tend here to put forth some preliminary notes on this issue, something that has been hotly disputed, at least in part thanks to Lukács and others such as Karl Korsch returning to it, the agenda in the 1920s. An alternative and radically anti-Hegelian approach was put forward by Louis Althusser and his colleagues in the 1960s. They began with a view of philosophy as a theory of the theoretical practice, a science whose object was overall relationship between different sciences and their objects, but this rapidly fell into irresolvable contradiction itself. A third approach, based on the Anglo-American analytic philosophy, collapsed almost as soon as it came into being. The failure of Althusser's first theory led him quickly to radically downgrade the significance of philosophy as a practice. It was not a science, for it had no object, and thus ultimately no standard of reference for solving its own problems. Let us be good sports. This is a quote from Althusser. Philosophers at work. It is well worth going out of your way to have a close look at such a spectacle. What spectacle? Why comedy? Bergson has explained, and Chaplin has shown that ultimately comedy is always a matter of a man missing a step or falling into a hole. With philosophers, you know what to expect. At some point, they will fall flat on their faces. God, Althusser is pretty funny. Althusser rather concludes that philosophy as a practice consists in posing problems to theory proper, i.e., scientific analysis of society, and to the radical activity of the masses in overthrowing oppression. It is the god of the gaps, as it were. The direct reading of the Marxist classics, Althusser's work is quite problematic. He tends to rather selectively quote forefathers to shoehorn them into a particular framework in which he operates. In this respect, however, he is quite faithful. The fundamental intellectual aspiration at the heart of classical Marxism is to scientificity. And just as modern physics ultimately abolished what is previously called natural philosophy, so a scientific understanding of the motor forces of history, in so much as it is achieved, should do away with philosophies of history in the older sense. Given the differences in nature of their objects, the science of history would surely differ radically in its methods from investigation from, say, physics, but some means must be found to produce a discourse that is, broadly speaking, cumulative. A Marxist account is thus necessarily open, and Marxian dialectic must, while operating at a considerable level of abstraction from natural sciences, be able to account for their exogenous determinations as opposed to positing a strictly endogenous dialectical development. Hence Marx's enthusiasm for Darwin's work, the interest of which he and Hegel followed developments in natural science, and for that matter, the scandalous passage Lukács identifies in Engels. All right. Ludwig Feuerbach concerning science and industry. Yet, if we cannot consider human or even specifically capitalist society as some kind of androgynous logical development, the category is made flesh, then we are left with the thorny question of exactly what relationship with the logic of social forms has lived history of society. Quite apart from the intervention of nature, my view is that it is impossible to solve the problem once and for all without again falling into the incoherence of a conceptual mythology. The utility of dialectical method cannot be assumed, whether openly or tacitly, without breaking with Marxist realism. It must rather be established with reference to the alien matter itself, the dreaded facts. Marx's mode of exposition in Capital is typically thought of as having a close correspondence to Hegel's logic. Yet there are points where the dense logical argument breaks off for 50 or 100 pages of historical narrative, which, however, cannot be reduced to mere historical illustrations. The chapter on the working day in England, for example, is a means by which the text moves from an absolute towards a relative surplus value, not only due to the internal contradictions in the former, absolute natural limits to the working day, for example, but a long and messy battle with the industrial bourgeoisie, their vulgar economists, and the nascent workers' movement, and the Tory factory inspectors, all as indispensable protagonists. Without this cast of thousands, many of the famous results of Marxist analysis, the compositions of capital, falling rate of profit, and so on, could not have been discovered. The broader lens is this: no mode of production is immaculately conceived. Capitalism, as socialism surely will, emerge out of its predecessor after prolonged birth pains. This is something that I agree with, but I've also pointed out it doesn't mean it's the same as its predecessor. And if you do assert that it's the same as its predecessor, you're basically making the same argument with people who say there's no distinction between medieval modes of production and capitalism, as is often made by anthropologists, by people at member school, etc. All right. The emergence of capitalism in all European countries is marked by a long series of revolutions and torturous compromises with elements of the Ancien regime. We need only to mention the various churches. With the rise of the proletariat movement, those comprise a matter of urgent necessity. A pure capitalist society has never and will never exist, simply due to the problems of historical inertia. Sorry, guys. That also means that the we're beyond pure capitalism and back in the neo-feudalism is also a misunderstanding of what the pure capitalist era was. This is a horribly botched way of thinking historically, and yet people posit it all the time in the Marxist world right now. Probably because they're not very good at thinking historically. And we have historians themselves to blame for that, given that the focus on microhistory, which was not initially meant to undo any grand narratives of history, it was picked up in the same time period as post-structuralist critiques of grand narratives and used to make history not try to posit any laws or rules or anything like that, but merely offer descriptions, thus removing any attempt to have scientificity. Now, we can say that the scientificity was a bad goal, and many people in the humanities do, or they can say that science doesn't make sense, like people on the Lukácsian critical theorists do, or that the sociologists like Latour, you can't see science outside of its network of relations and actor interactions, which Latourians do. But nonetheless, you have to account for it somehow. Okay. Even if one did, the society would be faced immediately with the contradiction of the capitalist reproduction. That is, it is based simultaneously on the assumption of sovereign free individuals and at the same time, now fully globalized division of labor and it's thus collective. Institutions such as the state, which exist to represent collective interests of capital as opposed to individual capitals, albeit very often imperfectly, thus cannot be purely determined, as Lukács suggests, by the commodity structure. Neither can the various ideologies, which attempt to suspend the contradiction at the level of an individual subject. Generalized commodity production sets limits to those institutions, but in turn is reliant on them for its own reproduction, and thus subject to their own limits. Given this level of complexity, the dialectic is an indispensable tool of analysis. Capitalism is irredeemably split, as societies before it, and grasping in its tensions through time is a task for the dialectical thought. It is not made necessary by all the problems of society finding their solution in the riddle of the commodity structure. What's the issue? It may seem that I have been pretty harsh on history and class consciousness here. What emerges is a text of dynamic millenarianism, a hermetic philosophy of history with an essentially circular logic and a physical historical tendency that obscures rather than sharpens the power of Marxism, as philosophy surely should. It is a description which, no doubt, many admirers of the book will barely recognize, but more flattering characterizations only serve to exacerbate the internal contradictions of this acutely contradictory product. It is worth considering whether there is anything, on the contrary, worth salvaging from the book. My opinion is there is not much. Some incidental arguments are illuminating, as noted. Parts of the essay on organization survive outside the voluntaristic problematic that produced them. The specific phase on which the aspiration to totality that opens up the first Rosa Luxemburg chapter is acceptable, though not the conception of totality. Although the conception of totality it mobilizes is not. The commentary on Kant, Fichte, and Hegel have some pedagogical value. It is clear that Lukács knows his stuff on these thinkers, but it is necessarily limited by its purpose as an ancillary to an overall argument which is ultimately incoherent. Indeed, there is much more to say. Very much more has been said on the subject of Hegel, who has entered my argument exclusively in the matter that he is read by Lukács. Yet, incomparably dense and wide-ranging work that bears his name is by no means exhausted by the orthodox interpretation. Certainly, it would be absurd to deny the importance of Hegel to Marxist theoretical framework, or the usefulness of working understanding of the basic conceptual moves in Hegel's philosophy for illuminating Marx's more abstruse reflections are indeed our own researches. Lukács' mistake is to read Marxism simply as radicalized Hegelianism, as I will accuse Platypus Affiliated Society of doing myself, and have when I left the organization. which ends up falling prey to the old sins of Hegelianism proper. As a historical document, we may rather patronizingly characterize history and class consciousness as representative of the best of the spirit and the worst of the history of the time. There is no denying the revolutionary elan of those pages, but equally no way to defend their revolutionary utility. Lukács' attempts to defend Bolshevism against the inert, philosophical, moribund Marxism of the Second International Center, and yet it was precisely the very same Marxism that enabled the Bolsheviks to become mass. So Lukács, quite against his own intentions, defends instead the voluntarist sects, the likes of which the Bolsheviks swept aside. Yet it survives today as a central point of reference for thousands of Marxists, and for unacknowledged for what, and an unacknowledged one for many more. For some, the idea of revolutionary consciousness is imminent to our situation, allows them to believe that, despite their small numbers, the revolution they speak of is not far away as all that. For others, the pessimists, it provides a germ of a theory of the impossible, terrifying power of the commodity society, and thus a justification for the critical theoretical radicalism and political quietism. We might invert Gramsci's classic ethic here, and suggest that post-Frankfurt School and post-situational milieu suffer from optimism of the intellect and pessimism of the will. Both attractions are products of our undeniable historical weakness, whose importance is respectfully dismissed or inflated. In fact, our weakness is neither the illusion nor the necessity. The scattered, demoralized forces of the Marxist left can become a mass movement. Marx himself started off from a worse position, and so did the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But we cannot do it on the basis of conforming conceptual mythologies or dead political strategies. Now, we're going to go into some of the responses to this here, and we're going to really go into tearing this, apart and Chris Catron's element. But this does give into a lot of why I had problems with Lukács, problems with Platypus, about what I considered idealist typologies from which they attributed to history itself, as if history was a concrete thing, a singular thing, of which the totality of which can be tasted singly all the way through, as noted in bourgeois values and virtues. And also, if you can reduce this, shifts in this are not really shifts that emerge out of it, but are really a continuity of the same thing. But if you take this to its logical conclusion, there is no movement in history. There are only great figures and great values. What is a Marxist to do with that? What is anyone to do with that? To oscillate wildly between pessimism and optimism, as the Marxist movement has done, to blame other leftists for every problem because you leftists are somehow special and can see through the mess, even though you're a product of the same totality as everyone else? How does that make any sense? Well, of course it doesn't, but that's part of the point. It is not that the people portraying this are trying to mislead you or gaslight you or, a movie. That's how they think. And thus they think totemically as well. A person or an event can represent the entirety of the social totality, as somehow it emerges from the commodity form, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that makes everything an analogy to something else. Think it through. But we'll come back to this debate. I'm not willing to throw all of Lukács out myself, but I actually tend to like some, not all, of the later Lukács more than the early Lukács. I think history of class consciousness, as I've said many times, removes most of the content of Marxism, but makes it a method which is actually dependent on the content in a way that the first statements contradict. And this is not caught out by very many people. Turley does. Some other people do too. That doesn't mean that we should go full Althusserian, as many people do, although there are problems here. The problems of science and scienticity, theoretical constructions, critical theoretical Marxism versus scientific Marxism, what is meant by either. These are not things that we can solve in one essay or even one series of debates. But it's something we have to look at and not just assert for or against. I hope you read this essay. I didn't have a lot to say except in the beginning and closing, but it was part of my journey out of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and it led to beginnings of breaks with various thinkers in my life. Have a good day.